It's the idea that when you're having a difficult conversation about job eliminations or really anything, is there's always the objective of there's a message I need to share. But what really matters is, does this person know they're a valued human?
Mm.
Do they know I care? That has to be the end game.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations, where we believe when we communicate better, we live better. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Chris, and this is a happy new year. Lucy, happy new year. We're recording this on the second day. How are you today?
Yes, Happy New Year, Chris. I am I was a little cold, but I have nothing to complain about compared to you and your coldness.
Well, Lucy, today this is a topic that we've kind of hinted at over the years, or not years, but over the time we've had this podcast. But we don't personally have a ton of experience with this. Layoffs. And it's in the news a lot, especially because it's happened to lots of organizations, lots of industries across industries. I'm a victim of a layoff or a reduction in force. So it'll be interesting to hear from the other side, just thinking about how do you handle this conversation? How do you think about this conversation from the other side, from when you have to decide about this kind of stuff, or when you don't even have a choice about it? So I met Summer last year or last fall through my networking and through LinkedIn, and I love the work that she's doing. I think she's really cool. So Summer, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Summer, I love letting the guests introduce themselves because, I could always share who you are and read your bio, but I always like hearing, I think everybody likes hearing you, how you express yourself. So tell the audience who you are and how you got to where you're at.
Sure, I'll give you the short version and then we can dive in deeper wherever you want to.
Yeah.
So I'm Summer Miller. I'm based in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, so just north of Minneapolis. And I am a transplant out here to Minnesota from Phoenix and then originally from Oregon. So I've kind of moved around the states, but most of that time I was in corporate types of roles and mostly HR strategic types of roles. And just kind of grew up and moved through the motions of kind of learning and doing things, but staying in the same line of career trajectory. So just kind of thinking, what's the next step? What's the next step? And moving my way up. And eventually, I think like a lot of people with the pandemic, started thinking about, is this what I want my life to be focused on? Do I want it to look different? So now I've been in business about 2 years doing my own thing. So I left corporate America. I'm an entrepreneur now, and I focus on helping people, businesses specifically, navigate change without leaving people behind. So everything I do is people centered. It's based on what people need to be at their best in work and life. And I'm an educator at heart. So I teach at a couple universities when I'm not running my business. And then I'm a mom to 7 kids. So we're a blended family. So my husband is Jason. We have 3 adult kids and 4 kids at home. So that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. And are you just perpetually tired all the time with 7 kids?
Well, they've never all lived in the same house at the same time, so that
Okay.
helps us to kind of space it out. But I think I was when I was in my corporate role, because
Mm,
I think sometimes you can be doing work that just takes a lot out of you, where you feel like you don't have anything left to give at home. And I'm in a different space now, and I think some of that is it comes with not identifying yourself so closely with your job and how productive you are and those types of things. So now when I work, I'm doing things that are life-giving, kind of breathing
mm,
life into me, energizing, so that when I am with my family, I have something to give. And
mm.
so I'm less tired now, even though I might work more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
When we talk about this conversation, yeah, I think one of the reasons we connected or we love each other's work is because we're focused on not just the corporate stuff and the HR stuff, but how do we deal with people? How do we move people along and connect and uh, value our most important resource, which is the humans, which is the people that work in our organizations. Here's the problem: layoffs are such a hot topic issue because we only ever hear about it from the people who are laid off, like their experience of pain and all this stuff. So the layoff conversations, have you been a victim? I'll just use the word victim, but have you ever been on the receiving end of layoffs?
In a maybe an unusual way. So I was helping orchestrate a lot of those kinds of things in a company I was part of. So I was able to kind of plan my own exit and
Hmm.
benefit from a severance package. That's not most people's story. So
Yeah.
I would say never probably in the way that you described earlier. I know you said you had gone through job elimination. I've never had it unexpected. And that's the experience for most people is
Yeah.
it comes up quickly. Maybe they can kind of see the writing on the wall, but it's hard anyway you look at it. But I have been a part of making those decisions, thinking through how a company might tackle some of those challenges, how it's communicated. And
Hmm.
I have really good and really bad experiences with all of that. So that's hopefully things we can dive into because I think it's good for people to see kind of some of the different angles and understand what goes into it.
Yeah. I can't wait to dive in because I want to dive into all of that. How do you even think about it? How do you conceptualize who to lay off and the structure of all that? But also, how do you get into it when you're the messenger, right? Because I think a lot of people who have to deliver the message didn't make that decision either. They just were told like eliminate these few people or this group of people, and but yeah, I can't wait to just dive into it. So let's talk about this. When you think about layoff conversations, why are they so what makes this a hard conversation to have and to hold in the first place?
I think it's right back to the point that you just said. Most times, the people communicating it did not make the decision. So
Mm.
right there, there's already tension, and there's a lot of heaviness to the conversation. And one of the things that people may not always realize is when you're the person communicating, there's a job elimination, there's a reduction in force. Usually, a decision's been made. You're the messenger of that decision and you usually don't have freedom to say what you want to say. And
Mm.
people don't always realize that. But when things are happening and maybe there's a need to, it could be we're eliminating jobs because we have to achieve cost savings for a reason, right? There's some business reason that's driving this. The company is trying to do their best to make a business decision and to not make it personal, because then it's more fair, right? Kind of
Mm.
removing bias, basing it off of objective factors. But part of that is also being really objective in the language. Kind of why did this happen?
Mm.
What's next? And so that's why it sometimes will feel scripted to people if they're on the receiving end. Kind of these are the facts. This is what's happened. Here's what you can expect next. That also can feel cold, right? It can feel
Yeah.
uncaring. It can feel like you've worked with me all these years and all you're going to give me is like something you're reading off a script.
Right.
But a lot of times the messenger they aren't free to say what they want. They can't insert maybe the empathy and compassion that their heart wants to,
Mm.
because they have a role to play as a leader of that company at representing that message and it's provided to them. And that can be super hard on the receiving end because you don't have all that context. You just know, hey, Chris, you've been my boss for 10 years. And now you're telling me this like you don't even know me.
Mm.
And that's hard for the person receiving it for sure, because it feels out of nowhere and it conflicts with the relationship you have with that person. It doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make emotional or rational sense in that moment. But if you're the person giving the message, it can be heartbreaking to say, gosh, I've worked with Lucy for 10 years. I want her to know how valued she is and how important as a human being right now. And I don't feel like I can convey that. So
Mm.
there's a lot packed into that, but I would say one thing I would want people to know is that you often just don't have all the context as the person giving the message or the person receiving, because a lot of times we're kind of in this messy middle of the company. We're
Mm.
not in the driver's seat. We're just helping to move things along in the best we.
That's so interesting because I had never thought of that because it does seem cold. And I think there's ways you can kind of help manage the conversation, but yeah, it's not. I never realized you couldn't say certain things. Have either of you seen the movie Up in the Air with George Clooney?
Yeah, it's been a long while, but I've seen it.
So it's really about like I guess his company is he goes around just like being the messenger. He's like the heavy hand that like lays off people and gives a message.
Well, some
Um,
people will want to outsource that, or they'll want to have it done by HR or done by somebody else so that the leader who has the personal relationship doesn't have to be that person. At the end of the day, I would say, especially in larger companies, there is more of a view of what's the risk here.
hmm,
How should we say this so that we're objective and fair, but also to minimize risk?
yeah,
Because if you just had a leader go out and say whatever they wanted to say, that could open up risk. Maybe
hmm,
they would apologize, maybe they wouldn't give the right context, maybe they would do things that create, you know, an issue. And
yeah,
that there's a deeper issue there because that has to do with how do we trust our people? How do we prepare them to have conversations,
hmm,
right? I think there are ways to do this a lot better than what we often see.
Mhm.
But the reality is we're risk managing in a lot of
hmm.
cases in these conversations.
Let's dive into that now. Like, how can we, I think we'll go explore other things too, but I think while we're on it, how would we better trust people and be more transparent and balance that risk? Because I think it's fair to balance risk, but how do we be more human in that approach?
I think it's one of those that there's not the way to do it that's right and everyone
Yeah.
else is wrong. It's so nuanced, but I would say it has to do a lot with the culture of the company to begin with, which we can't fix
Yeah.
all of those cultures that are not
No.
healthy. But I would say usually when there is a job elimination, reduction in force, or whatever terminology is used, there's a business reason for it. And I think sometimes we're a little bit too protective of that business reason, what's behind this. But we're dealing with grown-ups, people who can understand complex things if you just bring them along. And so sometimes I think employees, maybe they can't know all the things that are happening behind the curtain, but they can know we need to grow or we have certain targets. And to meet those targets, these are the things that need to happen in our company. And if those things aren't happening, then we probably have to make adjustments. Well,
Hmm,
how could we do that? Here are the levers that we can pull, right? I think it's okay to be transparent about this is how we make money. This is how we stay in business. This is how we stay competitive so that people understand what part they play in all of that. I think that's a first step. It's more empowering for people to know how can I influence growth and success.
hmm,
But that also helps people to better understand when we're not successful or we're not growing or we face some kind of headwind, what are maybe some of the things we're going to have to do or look at or consider.
hmm,
So some of it is just treating people like grown-ups and helping them understand this is what it takes to run a successful business and here are the things that we can consider.
hmm,
That's part of it. But I think that when you have those messages, when you have to say the hard things or let people know, here are some of the potential realities, it's understanding that there's certain things that people need to be at their best. So we want people
hmm,
to feel trusted and involved and to feel like they have some autonomy. So
hmm.
along the way, before you ever get to the point of job elimination, you can build in some of the conditions for people to be at their best, to be more involved and more part of the conversation.
I'm wondering, kind of from your thought process, what are people that are receiving the message going through? Because I know what I went through, and I'm happy to share, but I'd love to hear from your perspective too. What do you think the people generally are feeling, thinking, needing, wanting when they're receiving that message?
It could trigger fear. It could trigger a lot of emotional reaction. You have to do something with it, kind of that fight or flight or freeze reaction, right? There's a
Yeah.
threat in front of you. You don't understand it. You don't have all the context. It's even hard to take it in from a sensory perspective because the
Mm,
emotions are probably high. And so you'll see different reactions. You'll see people who just shut down. It's like they're not even there. You'll see people who are more they want to kind of negotiate or fight for something.
mm, yeah.
Yeah, so there's different reactions that sometimes, and sometimes it'll be anger, right? People will get mad and want to point blame somewhere else. Those are things we do to protect ourselves. We hide to protect ourselves, we engage to protect ourselves. So you see all of these reactions, they're kind of stress reactions. And they sometimes don't make logical sense because you think I'm just telling them the facts.
Mm,
This isn't personal, right? It is personal to them, right? It's a threat to them.
mhm,
And I think that we have to understand that people need a way to sometimes time to process that in different ways. And the objective facts aren't enough because that's only engaging them intellectually, and they're not in a space to hear that well because they still feel deeply in that moment,
Mhm.
and they're not ready to just digest all of the facts,
Mm.
all the things you're reading off a sheet of paper, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it makes sense sometimes when you say, well, this reaction seemed out of hand, or this seemed like an overreaction. We just have to remember people are in self-protective mode, right? They're just
Right.
trying to manage the threat in front of them in the best way
Mm.
they can. And it does feel like
Yeah.
a threat, even if it's said kindly.
Mm.
It
Mm.
still is scary, right? To have something like that said, like all of a sudden my livelihood is in jeopardy.
Right. Right.
It's a scary place to be. And I think
Mm.
sometimes we think we can just kind of logic people into being okay with things where
Yeah.
um
Just
I don't know if you've read, there's a book I like a lot. It's called Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard by Chip and Dan Heath. Have you guys
That's
read
on my
that?
list of things to read.
I just started reading it.
It's a
Oh,
good
good.
one. I want to say it's not a new book, but it's one I keep coming back to. It's talking about, I'll break it down very simply. It's the idea that we have kind of the need to intellectually understand something, so the head and the heart, right? And we often are just speaking to the head. And they use the analogy of an elephant and a rider. So an elephant and a rider sitting on top of the elephant. And the rider is who you direct. This is where we're going. This is what it looks like. Kind of here's the vision. And the elephant is more of the emotions and motivation.
Mm.
And even if you tell the person, here's where we're going, here's the direction, the emotions, the elephant is stronger than the rider, right?
Mm.
And so if you can't move emotionally, if you don't feel motivated and confident to take steps forward, you can be stuck. And
Mm.
so but the way we orchestrate change in businesses is to speak to the writer. It's the intellectual understanding. And we don't think about how important it is for a person, a human being, to feel confident taking steps forward. And that's not
Mm.
just about job eliminations, layoffs, and all of that. That's anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You're talking to a whole person who lives, a broad, varied amount of experiences. And it's never just about the facts and the objective facts in a situation. It's always about the whole person.
Mm.
it sounds like really not just having the logic to play a role in that process, but also empathy rather
Mhm.
than judging, but having maybe empathy for everybody involved in the process,
Yeah.
not just for the person who is receiving the news that can be scared and frightened, upset, angry, or just frozen and in shock, but also for the leader that is delivering the news. That
Yeah.
oftentimes the leader didn't make the decision. They may not agree with the decision. They might be going through their own insecurities at the moment, and fright and fear and lots of different emotions. But even if they are making the decision, that can bring up a lot of feelings. So it's an emotional decision in a way, and process, which makes it
Mm.
difficult to deal with for a lot of people. So having empathy for each other and kind of understanding this is difficult, even when
It-
it seems like the leader is very cold. Maybe they have a reason for it.
yeah. It's so good you brought up the other parties, because I think sometimes we're just thinking about the company, the person, and that conversation, like how we're messaging something. But the person who gives the message, it's very hard for them
Yep.
to feel like I just said this in a way I would never say it if I could
Mm.
choose, right? And it's also hard for the people around the person who has been eliminated in their job, because
Absolutely.
people are, when you think about how many companies and teams think of themselves as family, right or wrong, sometimes we have these cultures that are family oriented, and you
Yep.
spend so much time together, and you build these bonds with people. Now all of a sudden somebody's gone.
Mm.
Mhm.
That's devastating for teams and
Yes.
coworkers
Yeah.
and leaders. And I think that it's one of the things I try to help influence when I'm working with a client who's facing something like this, is how the idea of how do you uphold the dignity of humans through this process as best you can.
Mm.
Because we know it's still a business. It's not a family, it's a business. So we have to think through, okay, what's the business decision? And what's the best way to care for people while we are still meeting business needs?
Mm,
And sometimes there are things that you can do. Let's say for a scenario that job elimination is inevitable. Positions have to be cut. The decision's been made. These are the people that will be impacted. You can still think through, how do we set them up for success? Are there things we can do to help them bridge this transition well? Can we give them some time to transition out well so that they can connect with people that are important to them, so they can
mm,
wrap up work in a way that they feel proud of, so that they have the support they need to move to the next step and so forth.
mm,
And too often companies will cut their losses quickly. They'll just say, and today's your last day, because
mm.
that feels cleaner sometimes
Yeah,
to the company. But it doesn't have to be that way. I would say there are circumstances where maybe there's a security risk, or
sure.
maybe it's a sales position and there's a concern about somebody maybe taking clients from one place to the next. There's reasons why you might want to cut ties immediately, but often you don't need to. You can transition well so that people know I'm valuable as a human being, as a contributor. This
Hmm.
wasn't personal. And so my company is doing what they can to make this be as positive a process as it can be.
Mm,
You can orchestrate it that way. It takes more time and intention, but it's so worthwhile when you think
mm.
about the people that are impacted, not just the people that are losing a job, but the people around them.
When I got laid off, I was given, it was like the beginning of the month. They gave me to the end of the month.
Yeah.
I had a friend who was a senior director at MIT. They laid him off in July, but they put him on, they kept him on until the end of December. They gave him a whole half year. I think they said that's how their policy was. Like, instead of giving a severance, like, because I got a severance in addition.
Yeah.
But my friend, like, or for how they did it, they, instead of giving a severance, they just let you keep you on
Mhm.
staff until the end of the year, or whatever
Yeah.
amount of months that is.
Mhm. Mm.
It's good to have some kind of runway, whether it's kind of working notice where you're actually working while you have that notice time, or some people will have, they might be told you have another month and then your severance begins, right? And you're
Yeah,
still like, you're still receiving compensation. You're just not actively working.
right.
Um, I think that there's a lot of good ways to do it, because it can be hard for some people if it's too long, because
Mm.
maybe they don't want to hang out for 6 months once they know,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's
But
true.
maybe 2 weeks is good, or
Right.
4.
Yeah, I've worked with clients that sometimes they had either even a year
Mhm.
when they were told this huge corporation were laying off a lot of people, and they were told maybe you have 12 months.
Yeah.
Um, and if you stay, then there is a retention bonus. This you can leave anytime if you want to, but then you are not gonna get the compensation, additional compensation.
Mhm.
Or if you stay, you're gonna have additional bonus. And so
Yeah.
they were incentivized to stay. However, it's been really difficult for them because they saw all the team members leaving month after month. They
Mm.
were
Mhm.
the ones staying, and now the new teams were being onboarded, often from different countries. So
Mhm.
that made things really difficult for a lot of people, and there was lots of feelings for lots of months.
Yeah. I could see that though. I think there's some good things about that scenario, is that people have some choice, some autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
and they can opt out. They can say, no, thanks.
True.
I
Yeah,
don't want to
Right.
ride this out.
I'm out. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good decision for people to have, or for people to say, I'm willing to put in the work and get that retention bonus.
Yeah.
It is good if you can create options for people, because we
Mhm.
do, as humans, we do like to have choices, even small
Yeah.
ones. It does, maybe you wouldn't have chosen to have your job eliminated, but if you can
Right.
choose something about how you exit so that you can care for yourself and your family if you have one at home, right?
Mm.
Those types of things, it's great to feel like you're in the driver's seat. And I think we need that in some respects, even in the tiny ways that might
Mm.
not seem significant to a business. Just being able to choose. I know sometimes we would say, we would love to have you stay on for the month. How do you feel about that time frame? And
Mm.
so I've had people come back and say, I'd really like, now that we know, I just want to transition my work well. And then when I'm done with that, could I exit?
Mm.
They didn't want the month, but it gave them a choice, right? Because I
Yeah.
could give flexibility there. It wasn't like they needed to leave immediately. I wanted them to leave on terms that were good for them. And that's much more empowering than me saying, and you have to be here through this day at 5 p.m.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right, right, right. Well, especially because if you've transitioned off all your work, at some point you're just sitting there not doing anything.
That's what they end up doing because they don't want to put anything new on their calendar, and they
Right.
don't want to take on anything new. And then eventually the days get really light and they're just kind of hanging out and they're like, I think I'm ready, but they need to ride it out to a certain day and time. So if you can give them some choice there, say, yes, take the time you need to transition, then let me know, when you feel like you're ready and everything is moved to the other people's plates and you feel like
Mm.
you're in a good place. That can be a really meaningful thing for someone. I think that sometimes we're afraid of giving people too many choices at that stage, but I've seen people with companies for 25 to 30 years that are cut off and told, today's your last day.
Mm.
Ouch.
So you can do this really badly, or you can
Mhm.
do this well. I think we have to be realistic with our expectations, though. You want to create the best experience possible. It doesn't mean it's going to feel good.
Mm.
And we can put a lot of pressure on ourselves, like, I want this to be a great experience. Well, it's maybe not going to be great. It's not going to feel great because somebody's losing a
Mhm.
job.
Yeah.
Right.
But you can still, in the midst of something hard, feel really valued as a human. So I think
Mm.
we have to kind of grab hold of what can that look like? How can I help this person to know they have absolute value, even in the midst of something hard?
So one of the things is really thinking about from the perspective of a leader, either leader who has a decision-making power that they can impact the decision making. And so looking at how can I give them maybe some choice, some options.
Yep.
Anything else they should think about how to make it more human for them? What else they could do to make it easier, this hard situation and process?
It probably depends on the situation, but I would say one thing I think people should do when they can is to have a conversation one-on-one instead of having a large call
Mm.
with a bunch of people who are all impacted at the same time,
Mm.
because
Mhm.
this feels really personal to people. So having a blast call to announce it or a blast email is pretty insensitive. It's
Yeah.
efficient, but it doesn't mean it's the right decision.
Mm.
So that's
Yeah.
something that I think people should really be mindful of is what's
Mm.
the best way to share this message? So
Mhm.
this person's dignity is upheld, right? That they know they matter. Even
Mhm.
if I'm reading from a script, people deserve a one-on-one conversation and a chance to ask questions or to connect back with questions because sometimes in that moment they don't know what to say, right?
True. Yeah.
They're not
Mhm.
ready, but you could say, here's the path.
Mhm.
Digest this. I know it's not easy to take all this in. Let's connect back if you'd like at this time and date or when you're ready.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
creating that connection back to you so they don't feel like they're just left out with all the things spinning in their head.
Mm.
And to go with that, I would just say it's remembering that humans, we need an amount of certainty in our brain. We need something to anchor to. And in a time like this, people have a hard time wrapping their head around what's happening, their head and their heart, right? Even if they saw it coming, I know people who've said, "Oh, I expect this," right? But still, when it happens, the
Yeah.
emotions and the brain is swirling and all of that. And it's knowing that people have we have a need for certainty. And if it doesn't exist, we will create it for ourselves because the
Mm.
brain needs to anchor to something. And so
Yeah.
sometimes we'll make up scenarios. We'll say, I know this happened because they like her better than me, or they like this guy better than me.
Yeah.
And you'll make up a how did we get here? How did I become the one that was impacted? And it's often it's within our power as leaders to give some context. How did we make a decision? So that people don't have to spin out of control.
Mhm.
And you can say that in the moment, which is hard for people to hear. But you can also let them know as a business practice when we need to look at things like this is how we make decisions so that it's fair and objective and we can remove as much bias as possible. And I've had teams I
Mhm.
worked with that understood that. Like we have a process we go through, and it helps us to look at the function and the job and not the person when we make the decision. Because if you're just looking at the individual people, sometimes you become very biased, right? I like
Right.
this person, we get along great, or we've worked together 20 years, and you're not necessarily thinking about the function and the business and what the business needs to grow. And sometimes that piece can feel a little cold, the business need, right? But you are running a business and you have to design a business for its own good.
Mm.
And so when you make decisions to eliminate jobs or to restructure or reallocate, you have to be thinking about what powers this business and are we designed well for that? If
Mm.
I'm going to eliminate a job, it needs to support that good design. And you can tell that story. You can help people understand the how we got there conversation so
Yeah.
that they can understand I could be a stellar human being, an amazing performer, great at my job, and still not be a good fit for the design of where this business is going.
Mm. I'm curious, how do you kind of balance that need to look at it like a business, which I agree with wholeheartedly. How do you balance that with leaders who are more purpose-driven leaders who are really all about people over profits and they want to make a difference, even nonprofits like that have to still make that decision because they're still businesses. They still have to grow or make money in some way. How do you balance that?
It's tricky, for sure. So I would say I do work with people that are more mission and purpose oriented. They're still running a business though. If they're a
Yeah.
nonprofit, they're still a business.
Yeah.
And I do
Yeah.
work with nonprofits. So we still look at the design for business. What does the business need to grow and thrive? Whether it's a nonprofit, for profit, it doesn't matter. And then because I do some of my work involves org design, that is how do you design to support that growth, right? From a people perspective, systems, processes, structure, all of that. You start to think through, okay, what are the functions we need? And now who is the right person to fit that function?
Mhm.
But you design for the business first, and then you find the right people to support it.
Mm.
So then when you're making a business decision, it's not really about it's not that you're not caring for the people, but you designed it in the right way to begin with. You would have designed to fulfill that mission or purpose in the way you structure and the positions you create, and then you found the right players. But sometimes business needs change. What worked for you in the past won't work for you in the future. And so I've
Mm.
seen that happen where maybe they had somebody that was a wonderful contributor to the business, but maybe doesn't have the right capabilities to take them into the future.
Mhm. Mhm.
And but the business has a mission or a purpose to fulfill. If that person can't be a part of bringing that to life, they're probably not the right fit.
Mhm.
But sometimes you can say, is there another seat that they could sit in where they would be a great fit now? So it doesn't necessarily mean we just cut people loose. I think in a lot of cases you can say maybe there's a shift that makes sense.
Yeah.
This person used to lead, fundraising. Now could they lead this other function? So there, I always look to see, is there another possibility to retain great people?
Would you say you're more of a fan of reallocation as opposed to or as an approach before you think about layoffs or reduction in force?
I would say strategic, maybe movement. I
Okay.
wouldn't just say, let's lift people from this job and put them over here because this is what we have now. Because that's not going to be what everyone wants anyway. People want choices.
Yeah.
We need some autonomy, but I think it's good to say this position's being eliminated. Here are some positions that might leverage the skill sets that you have. Would you be interested in one of these
Mm.
paths? And so I've seen that happen before where I was at a company where they eliminated everybody who had a certain job title, a coach title, right? Like performance coaching.
Yeah.
And that's just because that function didn't serve the design of the business and the growth they needed. And it didn't mean that wasn't valuable. But there were a lot of those folks that had skill sets where they could step into kind of project roles. They could step into training and development types of roles. Like there were other things that
Yeah.
they had transferable skills for. I don't think it makes sense to just lift and shift them to those jobs. which sometimes people do that. They're just like, and now you're a trainer, or and now you're over here. But
Yeah.
I would like to help people see those possibilities and what their appetite is for taking on a new adventure, but then giving them the choice to opt out, to say, if these paths don't look interesting, there still is a package here that you can take. And make it as generous as you can make it so that they can transition well to the next thing. But I think in the best cases I've seen, people have a little bit of a choose your adventure, like I can stay and do this. I can, and sometimes they have to apply and be considered like anyone else, but they're well positioned and they can be put in a priority queue for internal positions, right?
Yeah.
So you can do some things to make the path to their next step easier to navigate.
I'm curious because I'm passionate about emotional intelligence and how do we manage emotions. Since we shared that this is emotional conversation for everybody and decision.
Yeah.
What are some of your tips? How does the leader can manage their own emotion or the process during that conversation?
It's a big question because it's hard and different for everyone. But I would say one thing that I try to do, even when I've had these conversations, is I think through kind of what's within my control and what's within my influence. I can't control the script I have to read, right? Let's say I'm given something I have to say, and I've been in that spot before, and I read it through and I'm like, I would never really say this in this way to another human. Okay. I can't control that because I'm required to say it. And so then I think, what can I influence? Or are there pieces of this I can control? And so that I can make sure this person walks out of this conversation, know that they're a valued human being. And that can be, what do I say after that? Okay, we've gone through this detail. Then I can enter in with, I know this is a lot to take in, and you're probably going to have questions and maybe want to talk through some stuff. Here's how we can do that. I'm committed to helping you land well in your next step. And I don't know what all that will involve. So I'd like to connect back so we can talk through how I can best support you. So it's that extra stuff, right? It's me being able to put my fingerprints on the experience as best I can. And you can do that without compromising the script. I'm not apologizing for what decision's been made because that's not my role in that stage. My role is to care for the human and to be available to them when they're ready. And sometimes they're going to be ready, like they're going to want to dig into it right then. And sometimes they're going to say, I need a minute here. And they'll come back when they're ready, and you can reach out to follow up too. So I would just say, what can you control? What can you influence? Enter into those spaces and be your authentic self as a leader as best you can, as long as you're not compromising things that have been required for your role. It is a balance. It's a dance. It's tricky, right? But I think you have to take that step to stay true to your values and to who you are as a leader.
I imagine, like, if you're in a smaller business, you as the decision maker might also be the messenger. What differences or similarities, maybe it's the exact same thing, but how do you see that play out?
In a smaller business, people are much less formal about stuff like this.
Yeah.
Unless they have legal counsel or somebody else involved, right? And that can be good or bad. So I think that the good side is you can be more human and connected in these conversations. That does open you up to more risk. So there's the downside, right? Is if you are just saying all of these things and it's super apologetic and I'm so sorry and you've been our top person, but now we have to let you go. That opens up some risk to your company because it doesn't sound super objective, right? It could be really mixed in with your emotions. So I think that that's the risk when I work with a smaller business, kind of a leadership team who's having to make tough decisions. I try to really guide them to focus on the business function before they start deciding who's impacted. And that happens in big companies too. It's just a bit more structured in a big company. Smaller companies, they just start thinking people. So should Chris be gone, or should Summer, or should Lucie? And I try to get them to pause on that and say, where is your business going and what do you need to be successful? Now, how do these roles these positions support that?
Hmm.
And does Chris happen to be in a position that's not serving the company's needs? And if he is, could we use him in a different way? Is there another job that might be a good fit? So I just try to get them to reframe it a bit so that whatever they land on, they can support it well.
Hmm.
They can feel like they made a good business decision, but they can also treat you well in the process.
Yeah.
And if people don't have guidance, sometimes they can go a little bit rogue and cause problems for themselves or others, or cause a bad experience. So it can be a little messy. So I would say if you're a small business or a large business, you should have somebody helping to guide this kind of decision so that you do it with care and you remove the bias you need to, and you make objective decisions that you can support and you can feel as good as possible about for the
Yeah.
business. I think it's tied to the idea of empathy, but maybe not in the way everyone thinks of it. Not this whole put yourself in their shoes. That's kind of an aspect of empathy. But I would say enter into the discomfort with people without trying to fix them.
Hmm.
That's harder because we want to come in and say, it's going to be okay. You'll land on your feet. Like we have all these things people say, but people are just in the midst of something that's really painful, and it needs to be okay for them to be in that space without somebody trying to push them somewhere else.
Hmm.
And then being curious. So it's kind of a combination of empathy and curiosity. But the curiosity is the asking questions about what would be helpful for them. Like, how do they want to be supported? Um, instead of assuming you know what's going on and how to help them. Because
Hmm.
some people, they aren't ready to start talking about fixing up their resume and looking for jobs, and that's okay. I think that we need to get to some of that stuff on our own timing. So that's how I help with that, is just saying, how can I demonstrate empathy by being in the discomfort with them in the way that's meaningful for them? And how can I ask the right questions so I know how to support them in a way that matters?
Hmm.
Not the way I would want it, the way they need it. And some of them want nothing to do with you because you're the messenger of some bad news.
Yeah.
But then I sometimes say, is there someone else that could be helpful?
Hmm.
If not me. Sometimes it's a peer, sometimes it's someone in HR.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be me. I just want to know they're cared for.
Mm. I love them. So that sounds like really creating that space for them to feel whatever they're feeling at the moment.
Mhm.
And also showing support by not assuming we know what they need or want, but
Yeah.
actually having curiosity and asking questions. How can I support you in this situation? Or whenever you think about it, let me know. We can talk about it
Yeah.
later.
I think that's just good practice for humans in general.
Mhm.
Hmm.
True.
That we sit with people where they need us to be, and we don't try and push our agenda with them. And we're not there to fix them. We're there to support in ways that matter.
Can I ask you a big picture strategy question?
Sure.
Let's say, because we just talked about small businesses, I'm interested. Let's say you are, multinational, got a workforce of like 6,000 people. Now you got to reduce your force by like 1,500, right?
Mhm.
I agree with you. I think one-to-one conversations are the best. How would you think about that? How would you conceptualize that when you have so many people over a broad geographical area?
It's really tough. So there's no answer that everyone will love. So I'll start there to say there's not a right
Sure.
way. I think that there's certain things that you have to think through when you're orchestrating something that big, is to understand your timeline. Like, does this all need to happen at once? Is there any reason that we should maybe stagger it over time? And does that create more swirl than we want? Because sometimes when you feel like every quarter we have a big round of layoffs, that creates anxiety, right?
Mm,
For people.
It does.
yeah.
Sometimes it's better to just do the thing you know you have to do in one sweep so that people can start to kind of refresh and figure out what's next. Um, I think that's where you get into the large calls, right? And that sometimes is unavoidable. And so if you do need to have a call, let's say everyone who's a project manager has to get on a call and that function's being eliminated. Let's pretend that's our scenario.
Hmm.
And let's say that's 100 people. That's a lot of people on a call to hear this kind of news. So I think that if you have to do it that way, it has to be, I would say always make it voice to voice at least. I wouldn't never do it through an email. And it needs to be somebody that's a trusted voice if at all possible. So
Mm.
somebody who has cared for this audience that they know and they trust. And sometimes people will try to have a CEO have that conversation. And that person is too far removed to be a trusted voice. It doesn't mean they're not respected as the leader of the company, but you need someone who feels a bit more accessible to be the messenger if at all possible.
Mm.
So where I've seen this work better, it's never amazing, okay, when it's a call
Sure.
with a bunch of people. But you could say, this is someone we trust. They're able to maybe have a hand in crafting the message for this audience, even though they're being objective. They know the audience knows them. There's a level of trust and connection. And then give people a path to talk one-on-one as a follow-up with their own leader. And then you can also create opportunities for peers to connect if they need to, for support. So I think that you can create two-way communication channels throughout the process to ease it, to make it better. It's not going to be as good as if they got a one-on-one conversation to hear the news, but it's probably the best that you can do in those kinds of circumstances when it's so huge.
Yeah.
Because sometimes, I mean, ideally, yeah, the leader would talk with each of their employees, but if you had to do 100 conversations in a day, I mean, that's not probably something that is doable, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of factors that you would want to consider, but those are kind of broad ideas that people could use. Just remember that kind of that you talked about the idea of feeling safe before, right? And that people, even with hard messages, they're better received by someone you trust because you feel like that they have
Mm.
your best interest in mind.
Yep.
As long as they've had a track record of that in the past, right? And we sometimes put too much in having an executive send a message, and that voice is just too distant in most cases.
So really pausing and thinking about, again, going back to the empathy. What would make it easier for the people to receive? Who would be the best person to deliver the message that people actually trust, not just respect, but also trust?
Yeah. And there's kind of the trust is one of those words that you can define a lot of different ways. I would say
True.
we trust people to do their jobs. We trust them big picture to do stuff. But
Mhm.
you've probably been in the trenches with people that you trust differently,
Mhm.
right? Where
Yeah.
it's more vulnerable. They're the people
Mhm.
who know like that you don't have it all figured out and they still think you're great anyway, right? And
Yeah.
you want that person, that kind of trust in that conversation if at all possible. And that just makes a difference for people to know that they are in a safe space when they're hearing hard news.
Mhm.
Mm.
So it sounds like somebody they have a better relationship and closer relationship with
Yeah.
and connection. Mhm.
And it doesn't always exist. So when that if somebody has to give a message and they still are like, I don't know all these people personally, because that happens,
Yeah.
then I'll say, how can you create a space for them to connect with people they know well after this conversation?
Mhm.
And that could be their leader and their team come together. Because there are cases where the immediate leader has nothing to do with the decision. They're hearing it like maybe at the same time as their staff, maybe
Mm.
5 minutes before.
Mhm.
I know one time I was put on a call with a leader, and it was, I want to say 15 minutes before a large call was scheduled. And it was, hey, we're about to make an announcement. You have a new job. You're going to move over here. Half your team's going to be gone. Half your team's going to go over here. They're about to find out, right? And you're like, what do I do with that? Because I didn't have time scheduled to meet with my team and follow up and do all the things. You can give leaders a heads up so that they can create those
Yeah.
forums for safe conversation.
Mhm.
But
Mm.
that didn't happen in my case. So I was doing the mad
Ugh.
scramble to like take care of people, right?
What are some of the most surprising reactions you've had to hearing the news? Like you've given the news and like you didn't expect this reaction.
I think probably I expect anything now because I've done this enough that I'm like, We all react differently.
Mm.
I think that people have been angry and have yelled. I think that's the thing that maybe is the most surprising in a business environment when you're not used to seeing that, right?
Mm,
It's not unexpected if you just think about what's happening and how people react to threat, right? But it's sometimes surprising because you see a different side of someone's, personality or character that you're like, this is out of character for them. This isn't who they are. But they're not being rational in that moment. It's an emotional response. So I think that I've had that happen several times where somebody either yelled at me or yelled at the leader that was in the room with me because I've been in HR. So sometimes I've been the HR person with the leader, helping guide them through. And so
mm,
I take the blame because I'm there and I'm HR, right? Even if it wasn't my decision, because often these things are not HR's decision. They are there to
yep.
support and make it the best possible experience. But sometimes you take the blame as the
Yeah.
HR person because people don't know. So I would say not surprising at all anymore. But those anytime you're yelled at or blamed for something you don't own, it's hard, right?
Mm,
But I think we have to just have a lot of compassion for the person and what they're going through to extend some grace to be like, I know this isn't your character. You're hurting. And out of hurt and out of threat, a lot of things come out that wouldn't be our best moments. And so I hold those loosely. I don't hold anger against people. I'm kind of like, you're entitled to have a little bit of an emotional freak out.
mm.
Anyone would feel a lot of emotional pressure, and that comes out in so many different ways.
Summer, I don't know if this has ever happened, but we always wonder, what if somebody were to turn on our podcast and fast forward to this point in the episode? We don't know why, but let's say they did and they skipped the entire first part of the episode. What would be 1 to 2 big takeaways for them that you'd want them to walk away with?
Well, some of them I've said, I'll maybe say it in different words, but it's the idea that when you're having a difficult conversation about job eliminations or really anything, is there's always the objective of there's a message I need to share. But what really matters is, does this person know they're a valued human?
Mm,
Do they know I care? That has to be the end game, even if you're saying hard things. So before you think about these are all the things I need to say, it's that idea beginning with the end in mind. I want them to walk out of this conversation knowing they're valued, even in the
mm,
midst of a hard message. How do I get there? And then you look at, okay, what are the things I have to say? What are the things I need to say? Or how can I supplement this to get to that outcome? And that's just, it's being experience based, right? Human centered. So I would say that's the biggest thing that may think of it like a guiding principle for difficult conversations. And the other piece of that, which I talked about, is focus on what you can control and influence in the whole process. Because this is the kind of conversation, anything around job elimination, a lot of us are kind of in that we're not the decision maker, we're just the messenger. And that could feel like a disempowering role to have, but you can flip that. You can make a difference with that role, even though it feels like your options are limited. You just have to think about how to approach it in a way where you can bring your best to that conversation in that relationship. So those are my two things.
I loved your approach of being more human centered and just valuing people. I think it I think it resonates with me. That's the word. I think that's why we connect is
Yeah.
we love that work of being more human centered in the way we do our work.
But I also love that we are pausing and reflecting. How can we have this conversation better? And
We all need
really,
that.
and it's so sometimes hard to pause when we are feeling stressed and we are feeling the pressure. I have to do this now.
Mhm.
So it takes also courage, maybe, and really a lot of empathy for everybody involved in the process, for the people receiving the message, and also for us if we need to deliver the message. And let's say we really don't want the person to leave, but that's the business decision that makes sense. So also having creating that space for ourselves and for the other person. So how to make these conversations through a lens of empathy, not just the reason, and combine both the rider and the elephant, as you mentioned earlier.
Yes, read that book if you haven't. So it's a good one, and it helped me to stop trying to push the elephant down the path and to motivate and support. And I'm not a naturally empathetic person, so I needed to learn some of those practices. I'm much more of a here are the facts person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have to care about what motivates people and what compels them and to move forward and have confidence. And that book, it helped to unlock some of that for my head and heart.
It reminds me that sometimes what seems to the brain as the most effective and efficient way, let's just send an email. It's just quick. Let's get it done quickly. Might not be the best way to handle things, actually. It might not be as effective. Yes.
You know what's bringing it up for me is this whole conversation makes me appreciate the way my boss told me the news, because I think she hit on a lot of the notes that you talked about. You know, she I didn't tell a story earlier because I didn't want to make this episode about me, but you know, it was, she started, clearly she had a script, because like now looking back, or even in the moment, I couldn't understand what she was saying. I thought she was just saying I was being moved to a different department, my whole department.
Yeah.
And so I had to ask to clarify, wait, am I moving under this, or am I being laid off? And she had to clarify, and then but then she actually said, I don't want you to ask any questions. I want you to just pause, take a breath, and then we continued the conversation, because I just had a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And then she said, I want to have a follow-up conversation. I want you to take tomorrow off, take the rest of today off, take tomorrow off. Let's come back Monday. Let's talk and do this. And
great.
like, I thought it was a great, like, even in the moment, I thought it was a great approach. But looking back now, I also think about all these other situations and what you talked about, and I really appreciate that approach and how she handled it.
And she probably chose a lot of that because a lot of times that stuff's not required. It is give the message and let us know when you're done, right?
Yeah.
And it's more checklisty, right? Which to manage big stuff, you have to have a structure and you got to have a plan that you're executing. But I love it when leaders add in those meaningful steps, because they know you. They've got a relationship and they know what you need to be able to move onto what's next.
So shout out to Heidi. Great job.
Yay.
Hey, Heidi.
Summer. Let's say somebody will listen to our podcast and they say, I need to know more. I need Summer's help. How they can reach you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. So it's Summer Miller, EDD. That's my letters after my name, but my website is sdmintegrativeconsulting.com. So you can go on there. Most of what you'll see there is not directly related to job elimination. I mostly work with businesses to help them navigate change with a people-centered perspective. So not leaving people behind. But I would say everything I do is about people-centered leadership and change and growth. So it is, how do you prioritize what people need so that they can bring their best to work and relationships? So that's where you find me, on my website, on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to just share resources too, because I'm a lifelong learner. I have way too much schooling behind me and reading behind me to not want to share it with everyone. So I'm an educator at heart. That's what I do.
I love it. Thank you.
I love that. Yeah, we'll put all those links in the show notes below. And Summer, thank you for being here. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was really enlightening for me and for us. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Summer.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was great.